All right, good afternoon. My name is Steve Goldsmith. I'm the moderator. For those of you who have come to listen to Mayor Frank Scott, he's not here and couldn't make it because of city business, so you're stuck with us. But Santi will be very entertaining. So we're going to talk about Gen AI in city government, and you can see who we are from the screen, but let me say, at least the work I do with mayors across the country, there's probably no city and no CIO who's doing more with generative AI, actually doing it, than Santiago Garces in the city of Boston. So you'll be in for a treat. I've got a number of questions for you, and particularly since Frank's not here, more questions than I anticipated. But you have an unusual path to Boston City Hall that took you through several other cities. Just a minute or two about that path and what your current set of responsibilities are before I get into generative AI.
Sure thing. Well, thank you again, and thank you for having us. So I think my path started when I was about to graduate from my master's in entrepreneurship in science and technology at Notre Dame. And a group of community leaders were excited because there's a young mayor that was trying to bring new energy and save South Bend or revitalize South Bend, which has been named as one of the top 10 dying cities. And his name is Pete Buttigieg. And several of us that were graduating from the master's program got intrigued by these community leaders about what is it that we could do with our technical education in public service. And we started a fellowship, and we did that for a year. And I kind of fell in love with the business of cities, like the complexity of how is it that we try to drive all these different pieces of infrastructure, all these different services to try to make people be able to live better, healthier, happier lives in a really small space. And so then after that first year, I was offered to start an innovation and performance program in South Bend, and then I became the city's first chief innovation officer. And then I went to Pittsburgh to be the director of innovation and performance and the CIO for the city. I went back to South Bend to work with the now mayor as executive director of community investment, where I was in charge of the business side of things, not IT. We have an amazing CIO that replaced me in South Bend, Denise Riddle. And now I get the pleasure and honor of working for Mayor Wu in Boston.
So Santi, I have a number of questions, and the audience is here to hear you talk about generative AI, but let me start with maybe the last question first. So I was deputy mayor here and for Mike Bloomberg, and went through a number of discussions in an effort to kind of catalyze the use of data in day-to-day decision-making. And we discussed how centralized that should be and how decentralized that should be. So as you think about an effort to get cities to use more of the potential of generative AI, some cities have a chief generative AI officer, and some are decentralizing it. If you wanted the best of it to occur and limit the worst of it, how would you organize a city?
So the beautiful thing about cities is that I think that they all try to solve some of the same problems, but we get to do it slightly differently, and that's not a bad thing. But I'll just give you an example from Boston. I felt very humbled when I first started because I went to meet with the city registrar, and Patty McMahon, at the time the city registrar, went and showed me some of the first books of birth certificates in the city of Boston. And the city of Boston is much older than the United States. It's a 400-year-old city. So we have the birth certificate of Benjamin Franklin, all this stuff. That is data, right? It's the record of a transaction of something that happened. And I think that what over time has happened is as we started implementing digital systems and we have ERPs and CIOs, as we started having more access to being able to use R and Python to be able to analyze data, we had chief data officers. Now we have Claude and ChatGPT and all this stuff, and we have like chief AI officers, but I think that we're all trying to solve the problem of how is it that we leverage the fact that part of the nature of what government does is record and track things, and how is it that we unleash the ability of delivering a better experience for people with those things. It's like, I think the same thing that the city registrar was doing 400 years ago, I am just like heir to being able to work with some really brilliant people to figure out what's the next iteration of that.
Yeah, but how much are you controlling from the CIO's office, and how much does the transportation commissioner allowed to do generative AI experimentation or fill in the blank?
So the approach that we took in Boston was one based on maybe humility and one practicality. So when OpenAI made ChatGPT generally available in November of 2022, within 5 days they had more than 1 million users. We realized that there's conversations with the mayor and with others that this was coming and it was pervasive, and either we learned about what it was and both how it could be useful, how it could be harmful, and how it might cost, that we were going to be on the receiving end of whatever was coming our way. And we was able to put together these guidelines on the use of generative AI. And what we decided is we were going to tell people, go use these tools. We gave them some guidelines around how to use the tools in a way that we thought managed the risk and some of the concerns, especially at the time, of not using any confidential private information in the prompts, making sure that people knew that whatever is generated is still the responsibility of an employee. You don't blame Excel for a budget shortfall. So AI might produce something that looks right, but it is you who have to determine, is that the thing that you intended, is that the outcome that you're going to drive, and then disclosing the use of the tool. And we just said, we want everybody to try it. We want people to tell us about when it works, when it doesn't work, and create an environment of trust. So I think that often some might be a little bit more condescending and patronizing towards public employees, but I'm like, these are the people that we trust to drive very heavy trucks, to carry guns, to teach our children. So we put a lot of faith and trust in our public employees, so why not learn from them about what are the things that they think work and don't. And because we created this environment of trust, they've also been the ones who tell us when they are afraid that something might not be working the way that they intend. So some of our ability to start blocking some applications and some things that are troublesome is because our employees were the ones who told us, hey, this worries me. Is this normal? Is this what should happen? And then we work with our legal department and we work with our teams to try to disable that.
So let's, when we talk about the potential of AI, Gen AI, let's divide the conversation the following way. Give us some examples of, a lot of what city officials and employees do is commodity, routine, red tape stuff. So help the audience think about how we use generative AI to outsource to the bots, the commodity, before, and then we'll talk about what to do with expertise that's been freed up from that. So start first with, because you've done more like practical use of generative AI than maybe anybody in the country at the city level. So give us some examples of how you're helping get rid of, outsource to machines that which is just taking commodity time on the part of people.
Yeah, I think, so I would break two big buckets of how is it that I think the generative AI plays in government. The first piece is as a general productivity tool with some pieces where there's specific support for specific tasks. And then secondly, around how is it that generative AI can help deliver new and better experiences for constituents. And I would say, this is not just about generative AI. If you go and you look about how a crew resurfaces pavement in Boston and most of your cities, they use big machines because it is safer, it is faster, and overall less expensive to go and restripe asphalt with a machine rather than doing it with pike in hand. So it's not like unprecedented of it's not, I don't think it's quite outsourcing, and for what it's worth it, but I don't think that at this point, and maybe ever, will you be able to fully replace a human being with a machine, but you can supplement the things that it does to make it easier, better, faster. So on the general productivity side of things, I mean, obviously the things that these tools are, they're machines of words. So summarizing something, being able to create a first draft, being able to reference. Our employees are expected to know and understand hundreds of pages worth of regulation. Like if you go and you look at the summary of the guideline on how to do public procurement, it's 200 pages long. That's the summary. And you're supposed to know and be able to reference specific parts of that when you're buying anything. By the way, that's not the only document, that's just a state law. You still have to go and look at the city policies. So what we see is there's a huge opportunity to enable knowledge access where the quality of knowledge that you're retrieving is only as good as the way that you manage the content for that knowledge. If you have information that is contradictory, so sometimes what we're starting to see is people say there's hallucinations. There are hallucinations, but sometimes what we see as hallucinations in some of these knowledge agents is you have contradictory information. And remember in South Bend, we had 3 definitions of what tall grass was: 12 inches, 6 inches, and 9 inches in the municipal code. So which one is it? And a constituent or any employee could go and find each of the definitions. Which one do you think is the one that you should uphold? So I think that there's this opportunity to create knowledge agents that create these virtuous cycles. We have some work that we're doing preliminarily on procurement that is not quite yet prime time to share about the results of that, but it's very exciting. We have, again, a general productivity tools to be able to do data analysis, to be able to share stuff. So like mostly there we have so much open data and so many open documents that we use it that way. Secondly, on the creating and enabling better experiences, we have 2 that I would share, and if you go to Boston's website, you should check it out, and then you should give us feedback. So the first one is on creating summaries of the roll calls, like the items upon which the city council votes on. And we create these 20-word summaries that makes it easier for people to see when they're scrolling through the website to see what is it that the council was voting on that occasion. And because the thing that we have from the city clerk is this long, kind of very dry legislative record of motion to approve the dismissal of the funds appropriated in the fiscal year. It's not very easy to tell what is it that they're actually voting on. So we have these 20-word summaries, and then like the record of what the council actually voted on. The summaries are generated using Gemini with an integration that we built with our Drupal, with our content management system. We did 19 years worth of records with $4, and it took a few seconds to go do it. We did some testing and validation. We took random samples of the things that were generated and then validated the accuracy, and we've seen improvement as we use more newer, better performing models. And the second example that we have is using AI for better experiences for search on the website. Better is not perfect. The initial feedback, if you go to the business page in our city website, you could go and see and play a little bit with our tool. It doesn't bring new content. It's not a chatbot, but it's bringing the semantic capabilities of large language models to be able to find information that otherwise people might not have found. And again, it's not perfect. We're finding some of the feedback. People are telling us, hey, you don't have this information. But sometimes because we don't have any information, we don't have any program about the thing that they're asking. So it's not about the quality of the search. It's just, we just don't do the thing that they want us to do.
I was reading that, and actually watching, that city employees who have jobs where they interact with people, like a child caseworker or a police officer, if they would stop taking notes during the conversation and use AI to record and digest the discussion, that they can watch the facial expressions, they can get more out of the interview and the summary of the and B, that you could take, then you could read all of those case notes for all of the caseworkers or all the police officers to kind of pull out routines and patterns. So have you gone that far in Boston yet?
No, and I think that partially because that use case would violate our guideline on not using confidential information. So I think that this is where, and the advantage that we have, I'm responsible for cybersecurity at the city as well. We're our chief information security officer, but I think that he would be really upset at me if I let us do something that is outrageous. But the concern being, there's, I think, two types of concerns. The first one is, what tool are you using to do what you described, right? And it's like, to what extent are you exfiltrating data that might be sensitive to a system that is not under the control of the city, under which we know that we don't have like the regulatory environment to make sure that the data is being treated safely. And the second piece is, this is what we're working as we revise the guidelines, but we want to be very careful. These tools can be really helpful in decision-making and productivity, but the expert judgment of a person that has to make a tough decision around like, whether you're gonna arrest someone, whether you're gonna give a benefit, whether you're gonna hire someone. These are decisions that impact people's lives. You want to enable better decision making. You want to be able to retrieve information that helps make a more informed decision. And you have to be careful about how you interject and bring information that is not there, that might not be accurate, that might be, so I think on the first piece, we are working on bringing tools that enable us to be able to do some of these things in a way that is private, in a way that is kind of an enterprise-supported environment. But on the second piece, what we're working is creating that clarity for employees so that they're not substituting their judgment and their critical thinking from the decision-making.
Well, I'm just supposed to ask you questions, not argue with you, but this is irresistible opportunity here. Let's just take this kind of, let's assume that you're inside your proprietary cloud, right? So you're not sharing information through generalized chat GPT. If I were a police supervisor, why wouldn't I have one of the tools, listen to every police dispatch, read every single case report, review the pictures of every broken robbery window, and identify officers that are productive, to identify officers whose language is racially insensitive, identify, not maybe even for purposes of discipline, but for purposes of training. How does that violate confidentiality? That actually makes discretion better.
So I think that this is where we have to understand the use of the tool in the context of the process and the management environment. It's about, not just about the technology, but again, if you think about a police report has the ability of impacting someone's ability of their freedom, their personal freedom. If there's inaccurate information in the report, you might mistakenly go and put someone in jail, or at least have them go through trial. So it's not that you, I'd say, it's not that I don't think that you should ever consider using these tools, and there might be an opportunity where you have tools that help verify the quality of police reports, but I think that is the notion that you're like outsourcing that act of writing that police report, and again, like officers have to swear an oath to be accurate and not to falsify his reports. That promise is something that is on the officer. I think that going in and replacing it with a machine is, so there's ways in which you could go and supplement. You could potentially make it easier to go and verify that the police report is accurate because you're comparing it with like an AI-generated transcript, all these things. But I think that this is where you have to think about what is the process and what are the human and social controls that we have around the process to be able to do these things in a way that's responsible.
All right, we'll move on. Although I'm not sure that algorithmic bias is more biased than human bias.
And like, well, I think that that's a great point. It's like, we're not comparing, people are not perfect. And the goal of AI, in some sense, like the AI transcription is also not going to be perfect. Like there's people that talk about Whisper and some of these models being not as good depending on some accents. They don't transcribe some people with some accents. And that's the kind of bias that the machines have. And it's not that it needs to be perfect. It's just, we just need to understand how well do these things work. And I think that the main piece that I would encourage people, and that we take very seriously in Boston, is we have to evaluate. It's not the vendor, it's not, we have to evaluate and test to see how accurate it is, and we are the ones who based on our understanding of the law, the regulation, and our ethical obligation to understand, is that error acceptable? And if so, how is it that it fits within a broader process?
So let's see if we can stimulate a few more examples, and then I may disclose to the audience that we spent 4 hours last night trying to redesign a whole new performance management system with generative AI, and maybe enlist them in that. But before we get to that point, give us 2 or 3 examples. I remember when I walked into your office X months ago, and you told me that you were not a very good coder, but you were a pretty good analyst. And so you had chat, whatever tool, do the coding for you, which gave you more time. So it was like you were hiring coders, but you didn't need to hire the coders. So give us practical examples of even small things that you've already done using AI.
I'd say I'm a rusty coder because I don't get to code very often. So the way that most people that learn how to code, you try something and then you go through Stack Overflow or through the documentation and miserably make your way through a list of errors until you get the thing to do the thing that you want. So that's my vibe. But with generative AI, what we have is the opportunity of going on building code. And I know enough about coding that I can go on review and supervise what is it that was done, understand the assumptions of if I picked only certain categories within a column, understanding this. So I'll give you practical, fun examples. Here's a good practical, I have to think a little bit. So our mayor had gone to a community meeting where she had been asked by some community members told her that they thought that their neighborhood had a disproportionate amount of construction and that it was really impacting the quality of life. It reduced the availability of parking, and the mayor wanted to do good by the people that she had talked to and asked, is this true? Do these people have more? It's also the neighborhood where I live, so I figured, well, this is a great question for generative AI. We have all of the data so here's the data that I looked at. We have all construction zones posted in the open data portal. We have all of the demographic information of all of our neighborhoods posted on the open data portal. And we have all of our streets open in the open data portal. So I started using AI again, this is all completely open. Anyone on planet Earth could have done the same thing that I did. Just going and seeing how many construction zones existed in each neighborhood given the amount of linear miles of road in that given. Some neighborhoods are bigger than others, so we're trying to normalize it. And then I was able to do this analysis, even like there was some discrepancy in the way that neighborhoods were described in a couple of the data sets, so I had to aggregate data from some neighborhoods in one of the data sets to match the other. ChatGPT did all of this for me. And then I was able to get to what is the number of work zones per mile per neighborhood. And then I was even able to compare it by with some demographic information. And then the mayor chose a software instead of going and showing people an ANOVA test. She decided to handle things differently, but again, we were able to show that this particular neighborhood did not have a higher proportion of factors towards the lower part of the distribution of amount of work zones. But now we know, and we know that it's still valid that the residents feel a certain way, but in an hour, I was able to do the kind of thing that it usually take an employee maybe a week, 2 weeks to go do the analysis, be able to do the visualization, normalize, come up with like a better indicator. And I was just able to keep going deeper on trying to get new ways of describing the problem.
So if you, let's use that example for a second. If you, into our conversation last night, if you, we're in New York City, which was the beginning point of CompStat, stat and performance programs. And those programs were dependent on a really smart guy, Bill Bratton, asking really good questions, and then some data geek in the back of the room 2 weeks later coming back with an analysis that helped inform X, Y, or Z. So let's think about what you just said, about what you did. And with generative AI, why can't every police captain, why can't every assistant deputy commissioner of transportation be doing those sorts of inquiries? How are my streets compared to this street? How's my drainage in this street affect my potholes? So shouldn't we be unleashing a utilization of data that's really been previously unmatched and we've just scratched the surface?
Why shouldn't we? Yeah. So being practical is like, yeah, I think that's a great question. And I think that imagine when that's happening not only in government, but outside of government. Imagine if like every resident was able to go and question the assumptions of what is being told by a public official. But they're able to argue not just about ideology, they're arguing about facts that we're sharing, but we're increasing the fidelity and the quality of the conversation because instead of now I'll ask you a question about a certain experience when you were deputy mayor here and worked with NYU with some community members about what the experience was. Do you want to share? Sorry, but it's a way of a question. Tell us about your...
Well, I'm not sure you're allowed to ask me questions. That's not the way it's supposed to work. But let's just thank you for the question, nevertheless. So what Santi's referencing was a very small example of what I think we're now capable of unleashing with generative AI, which is in the earlier days of the 311 call system, obviously everything is recorded. And Mayor Bloomberg began to visualize geographically sorted information by 311. So you can think about if you picture it, the size of the yellow circle represents how many complaints at that corner, and then if you drill down, you could see what was causing them and how long it took to resolve them. But that was all kind of captured in the city, but the community board presidents, maybe a few of you here today, were unable to actually analyze that data. So we hired NYU students to teach the community and provided free software to the community boards to help them understand the dynamics of the complaints in their neighborhood. On the theory that if they understood more, the agencies thought if they understood more, they would complain more. We thought that if they understood more, they might have answers that were going unrecognized by folks providing the services. So it feels to me like, and that was awkward and early, but it was interesting. So now shouldn't we be able to unleash that? It may take some data literacy and data training of the community and data training of, deeper into the city enterprise, but those sorts of insights should be just dramatically increased.
I would agree. And I think you use a great word. It's a little awkward. And I think that the technology is still a little bit awkward. There's times that these tools do things that are not what you anticipated. And even if you have some experience coding or doing data analysis, writing code in Python or R, it still sometimes does silly things. Like it is so weird. It'll do some things incredibly well and then some really basic thing terribly wrong. So it is, I think, awkward. It is at the point that the technology is still a little bit of the barrier. I think that the second piece that is interesting is also to the point about, this is why I don't think that it's just about replacing people, but like creating a new, rethinking what are the value-adding things that people do in government. So one of the things that our performance management team and our research and data team have started to do is they've created a data certification program. So they certified metrics. And what a certified metrics is a metric for which we understand what the business process by which we create the metric, we understand how it's measured, we document it. So it's like, why? Because we know that using that metric versus another metric gives us a higher fidelity of understanding of the answer and what are the assumptions of what is being captured. But if my data analysts are spending less time building dashboards and more time thinking about tying that number with the reality of what's happening in the city, and working with employees to understand that and what are the implications of a change in that metric, now you're talking. But so that's what I think it's about elevating the game of government, always focus on people, and the tools are just kind of fun and interesting, and I think that they seem really promising at being able to do what you experienced in New York.
So I got two really short questions because guy over there in the gray coat's telling me I have to hurry up. One, this is an audience that's, some city officials, some vendors, right? Too often cities buy a product and very rarely do they actually buy innovation, right? There's an RFP for a solution. So if a city wants to be creative and buy a solution, and the solution involves generative AI, what advice do you have to the audience about how to think about how specific the procurement should be and what rules and regulations it should? I mean, one of the problems with trying to regulate generative AI is even if you're well-intentioned, you can't get it right because it's moving so quickly. So what should a city do in its RFP process that will allow the vendor to respond with a creative use of generative AI, but within some sort of framework?
Yeah, I think, again, this is regardless of the city structure, understanding what your regulatory and technological controls are and make sure that what you're doing is consistent across the board. I don't think that it serves anyone to have more stringent controls on something than in the other stuff because the risk is kind of shared. But being consistent, two, being specific about what's the business problem that you're trying to solve and evaluate for that. It doesn't matter if it's AI, it doesn't matter if it's a human being, like if you are getting the answer that you need more accurately or doing something better than what you would otherwise, then that's the thing worth considering. And I think that when you're evaluating, consider bias. What are the types of people that might be vulnerable about the thing that you're doing, and then testing for performance for those groups. What is the type 1 and type 2 error for different situations that you might encounter in that particular problem? And I think like partially because you're talking about like there's so much change and disruption, it's like what might be the right answer now might not be the right answer forever, and there's ways of trying to test these things out in a smaller scale. So building modularly, building in ways in which you can change and replace things, thinking about like that you might find better performance somewhere else, I think is.
Okay, last question. If you're talking to the city officials, state, federal, who are in the audience, what one piece of advice would you have for them that would increase the velocity of generative AI deployment in their cities?
I don't know if you need velocity necessarily. I think that being responsible, I think having good, honest conversations with your employees and with your community about like what is it that you're trying to get out. And I think that that's when you're ground truthing about the outcomes that people agree on, and you can go and see, is generative AI or any technology helping you get to the thing that you want better with higher quality and faster, then it's a good solution. If it's not, or the cost is too big, these are expensive solutions. So sometimes maybe they work well, maybe it's great. But running Whisper on 2 million 3-in-1 calls, maybe it's really expensive. So maybe that's not a good solution at this point, and you need the prices to go down.
So given that my pay for this session is shameless self-promotion, I run a site at the Harvard Kennedy School called Data Smart City Solutions, where we have a number of use cases. And just today, a wonderful podcast with Santi and Mitch Weiss, the former chief of staff in Boston at the Harvard Business School, on how to apply generative AI in cities. Thank you very much for your time. We're adjourned.